I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to the latest episode of Producing Fun. My guest today is well-known rulebook editor, content creator, and good friend Paul Grogan of Gaming Rules. Paul is a true pillar of the UK board game community, and one of the hardest working people I know. From developing games to running conventions, from making videos to training demo teams, he's pretty much done it all. So I had to focus extra hard this week on keeping the conversation as focused as possible on just the topic that I wanted to pick his brains on: rulebooks. And what makes them great, and sometimes not so great. As I suspected, there was so much he had to say on this subject alone, it was very difficult to decide what to keep and what to cut this time. Paul's experience is beyond substantial. He has edited the rulebooks of games designed by some of the industry's biggest names, people like Vlaada Chvatil, the designer of multiple runaway success titles as diverse as Codenames or Mage Knight, or Vital Lacerda, whose heavy Euro games are often regarded as some of the very best in the genre. As, to use Paul's own description, a rulebook editor in all caps, his working relationship with these creators is really close. He's so trusted that he's become the exclusive editor of several top creators' work. As many as 100 rulebooks in, he really knows his stuff. If you are in any way interested in writing or editing a rulebook, I would strongly recommend you listen to this episode. Paul is a pleasure to listen to, but I can also say from personal experience of working with him on Mage Knight that his understanding of teaching games in multiple media in general is invaluable. He has a lot to say here, not only on the immediate practical challenges of structure and wording in rulebooks, but also on the broader perspective of how commercially important they are, and the increasing growth of new trends in games like built-in tutorials. We join the interview just as I've asked Paul how he got started as a rulebook editor.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. I remember when you spoke to me about you were going to do this podcast before you did episode 1, and it sounded like an interesting idea. So yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on. So how I got into rulebook editing is by pure accident. Now, when I answer this question, because I'm generally well known, patting myself on the back for being a fairly good rulebook editor. So a lot of people assume, oh, he must have like a degree in English, he's got professional qualifications. Right, none of that whatsoever. When I mean, I'm a gamer. I've been a gamer since the 80s, right? I am a passionate gamer. It is my hobby. It's become a job, not through deliberate choice. It was my choice to turn it into a career, but it kind of happened accidentally because I'm so passionate about the games. What happened is about, oh gosh, when would it have been now? What year are we in?
I think it's 2021. I think it's been very confusing the last year to work out exactly how long
especially this week, because it was a public holiday last weekend. So I'm still confused as to what day of the week it is.
Oh, 100%.
This was about 10 to 12 years ago, when my passion for games got to the point where I wanted to start doing things on a voluntary basis for some of the publishers that I love. So 2 publishers sprung to mind: Check Games Edition and Watch Your Game. Massive fan, bought every one of their games, loved their games, and I started making, going to see them at Essen every year and saying hello and everything else. And then I was like, look, I'm really interested. I love your games and I'm passionate about your games. If there's anything I can do, let me know. And it was like, well, I guess we could, send you our rule books that we're working on, and you can help us out maybe with them and reading through. And that's where it all started. It was purely me wanting to give something back to the companies that I enjoyed working for.
Interesting. So actually, that's very interesting. So it wasn't necessarily that you had a kind of specific thing in mind that you really wanted to do for that company. Like, oh, my dream has always been to edit rulebooks. No. It was more like, how can I help? I think what you're doing is great.
Yep. What can I do? So talking to them about their games, maybe even playtesting their games. They'd send me the files. I'd spend 3 evenings printing out all of the tiles and all of the components.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Then I'd get my friends round at a weekend. Now, this was all done on a voluntary basis because, I had a well-paid full-time job. I was fine financially, and I was doing this because for me, I was like, oh, this is amazing. I've just got Vlada's new game. He sent me a prototype of this game. Oh, let's literally spend about 12 hours printing it all out and invite my friends around and then feeding back to them. that's work, right? I was effectively doing work for them and feeding back all. I even went to conventions. I remember being at Bacon, which is a convention down in Exeter that happens every year. That's actually happening virtually this weekend. Starts today. But I was at I was at the real Bacon with a physical prototype of Dungeon Pets the year before it came out. And I spent the whole weekend, well, maybe not the whole weekend, but at least 50% of the weekend playing this game with people, demoing it to people and saying, this is a new CGE game that's coming later this year. Oh, this is from Vlaada, who did Dungeon Lord. Yeah. And I didn't get paid for any of that at all. And they were very happy. I was very happy because I was working on Vlaada's latest game. And then eventually CGE sat down with me. And I think this is all down to Vlaada. But Vlaada and the boss of CGE sat down with me. This is going back 8 or 9 years now, I think. And they said, Paul, you've been doing loads of work for us. You've been doing all of this. You've been doing demos at conventions. You've been helping us with our rule books. You've been helping playtest games. You've been doing all of this. We can't let you carry on doing this if we're not going to pay you to do it, because it's not fair. It's not fair on you. And I was like, okay, sure. Yeah, if you want to. And we basically made an agreement that I would track the hours that I spent working for them. We agreed on an hourly rate for that. And then I carried on doing what I was doing, but I was also getting paid for it, which I had to declare as extra income, and I did it all above board and officially. And that's how it all started. Now, what happened following that is over the next couple of years, my professional career was not working out for various reasons. And as I was starting to do more and more work, and I was thinking, well, I'm passionate about games. I love games. And now I'm actually sort of doing work in the games, and I was enjoying doing the work because I was doing, I was working on Vlaada's new game, and I was doing all of this stuff. I thought, I wonder if that I could actually maybe cut down on my work and maybe do more of this. And whilst at the same time, I've always loved teaching people how to play games. I was the one who in the 80s, Paul would get a new game, we'd all go around to Paul's house and Paul would teach us how to play a game. And in every gaming group that I've always been a member of, I was the one that taught people how to play games. And I actually love the process of teaching people. If I went to a convention for 4 days and spent all 4 days demoing games to people and didn't play anything, I'm really happy because I love teaching people how to play games. So I came up with the idea of, because I've no background in creating videos or anything, right? No background in that whatsoever. I came up with the idea that I would create a YouTube channel where I create videos on how to play games.
Makes sense, yeah.
And a couple of people pointed out to me that this has already been done. A couple of people have already done that. And I was like, oh, right, okay. I was unaware of that. But that's when I formed Gaming Rules, I did it with the intention of creating videos. That was the sole reason why Gaming Rules was formed, is to create instructional videos.
So it's much more focused purely on that element to begin with, rather than what it does today, which is your
50-50.
50-50. Well, it's kind of a bit more
than
that, because you've got videos.
Yeah.
Obviously edit rule books.
Yeah.
You also teach other people how to demo games, right? That's another part of what you do.
It is, but that's a small part of what I do.
Okay.
Yeah. So the whole rulebook editing, getting back to your original question, was because I was doing the videos, I was also doing bits of rulebook work. And then the rulebook work just more came in, and then more came in and more came in. So we are now where we are, in that a lot of people know Paul Grogan, Gaming Rules, he's that rulebook guy, and they don't realize I do videos as well. Every week I come across somebody who goes, oh, you also do videos? I thought you just did rulebooks. And it's like, whereas other people are like, oh yeah, he's the video guy. I didn't know he did rulebooks.
Yeah,
so I wear these
multiple
hats. So I fell into it accidentally. And I've just built up and built up and built up. And thankfully, I've ended up working on some fairly high profile games, which have then had a great reputation for having amazing rulebooks. And that's obviously been really good. But I have to say, a game that has an amazing rulebook, if I was the editor of it, it's not just down to me. And we'll probably touch on this later on. It is a big team effort of everybody involved. And it isn't just, you can't just look at a rulebook and go, this is an amazing rulebook. Yeah. Who's the designer? Right, no, because the designer usually has usually, I'm going to say usually, because you're an exception, the designer usually has nothing to do with the rule book, and the rule book is a big team effort of writer, editor, graphic designer, publisher, a whole bunch of other people.
Yeah, makes sense. So, makes a lot of sense. Well, definitely let's come back to that point, because I'm really, really interested in that point about what makes a good rulebook and kind of the team behind it. Because to your point, I'm sure, well, spoilers, it's a lot more complicated than just it's the editor or it's the designer. So that's very interesting. So how many rulebooks in total have you edited, do you think?
Gosh. Right, rough finger in the air. 60 to 100.
60 to 100,
maybe something like. It really depends on where you look at editing. Right, if you look at, for example, On Mars by Vital Lacerda, okay, most of that rule book is me. I wrote pretty much all of that rule book, and I was involved in that process from the start to the finish, right? Whereas there's another rule book which you could say I edited, where actually I only probably did maybe 2 days of work on it.
Yeah,
both of those rule books I'm down as the editor, but one of them took me about 10 to 15 hours, and another one took me about 100 to 150 hours.
Right.
So I've done quite a lot. I am planning on cutting down, but I think my skill set is in the structure and the writing of complex games. I mean, I can do other games as well, but bringing me into a rule book at the latter stages, and then I read through it and I go, this structure's all completely wrong. And they go, well, I'm sorry, but the structure's all set. We've done the layout and we just want you to proofread it. I'm like, well, you've got the wrong person then. Because that's, whilst I can do that, that's not really my area. So, yeah.
So immediately that raises an interesting question for me, which is, have they actually not just got the wrong person? Have they made the wrong process decision about when to bring an editor in at all, if they're bringing them in that late, in your opinion?
Possibly. Yeah, I mean that rulebook that I mentioned with the bad structure could have already had an editor, because there are different types of editors out there. I always say that there's 3 types of editors.
Oh, okay.
There are editors with a lowercase e. There are editors with a capital E, and there are editors all in caps. Right?
Okay.
And I'm the latter, because I know some editors that are, and this is not meant as any disrespect to them, one up from proofreaders.
Yeah, it's more like spelling and grammar.
It's spelling and grammar, and they will check the occasional sentence and they may make some suggestions, right? Then you've got the next level up of editing, where they'll look at it in a bit more detail. And then you've got me and other people like me who look at your rulebook and go, no, and the reason I'm saying this is because a company about 4 years ago was a new company, and they had a rulebook, and they posted on the various Facebook groups and social medias and said, tell us who the best rulebook editors are, or give us your recommendations of rulebook editors, because we need a rulebook editor for our new game, right? And then what they did is they contacted each of those people, and I was one of those people they contacted, and they contacted me for details of how I work, timescales, obviously cost, and all sorts of things like that. And I got the gig, I got the job, but they came back to me afterwards, and they actually said to me, they said, Paul, we spoke to 50 different editors. 50. I mean, that's a huge amount of people. 50? Yeah, this is what I got told. They said they approached 50 editors and asked them the same questions they asked me. Every single other editor gave them a price based on word count. I didn't.
Interesting.
I didn't. I gave them a price based on my hourly rate, and I said, and I will work within your budget and within your limit. Obviously, if you gave me a 100-page rulebook and said, Paul, you've got 5 hours to do it, I'll say no.
Quite reasonably so.
Yeah, but if you say, Paul, you're limited to 20 hours of work, I'm not going to then invoice them for 50 hours of work.
Yeah.
So, and I was the only editor in the 50 that they approached that gave them a price based on time spent rather than word. And that is because I can't give you a price based on word, because I don't know. Your rulebook might be good and just need some minor tweaks, or it literally might need completely restructuring, tearing apart, whole sections being moved around, and a massive rewrite. And I don't know that until I've actually started reading and working on it.
So this is really fascinating to me because one of the sort of trends I've seen a little bit within the board game world is treating board games like books.
Right.
So I noticed, for example, Osprey Games, when they were recently, well, actually, maybe 2 years ago now, they were advertising for someone to join the business. They had a role which they called game editor.
Yes.
And I thought that was weird to me because I don't think a game can be edited. And obviously, you know, what this podcast is about product. I come from a kind of a software product management background. And so when I'm looking at a game, I'm thinking, well, we're trying to overall craft this marketable experience for people. And the thought that it looks like a book editing where you're trying to preserve the authorial voice of like an individual, let's say like a novelist. It doesn't resemble that role, but it seems like, as with the rulebook editing, there's this sort of interesting trend amongst some organizations to see it in the terms of, this is text that's been produced that we're editing, which is almost, it doesn't seem to me like that's your approach at all.
No.
You're looking at it from the point of view of, would it be fair to say, this object is what helps people learn the game.
Yeah.
So you're looking for, how can I maximize the effect of how good this is at teaching the game? Potentially then it doesn't even necessarily, the fact that it is a book rather is secondary.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's interesting because Osprey Games, I know people who work at Osprey. I'm friends with some of them, and they are one of my clients. I do some work for them.
Okay.
So I'm curious about this because game editor, I'm thinking, well, what is that role? I'm right after this, right after we finish this, I am going to speak to my contact at Osprey and say, are you that person? Are you a game editor?
Yeah.
Because if it is who I think it is,
yeah,
they do game development, but they also help with the rule books.
Interesting.
So it's two hats, because a game developer and somebody who helps write and edit rule books are different skill sets, but that could be the same person.
Yeah.
Because I do game development as well. So
yeah, that I find that really fascinating, because it seems like we're all working on fundamentally the same roles.
Yeah,
is fundamentally what we're doing. But yeah, that's a really interesting one. That's definitely one to explore more, I think, because understanding what the roles are is, to me, really fascinating, the point of view of what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. And in the same way that, you know, it seems like your rulebook editing interest has emerged much more from your very long-lived passion for teaching games, rather than because, you know, you really enjoy the kind of the process of like editing documents. You know, I've got right because
hate that.
I can understand it, right? Because it's really interesting is that, you know, I have a friend of mine, she's an editor for a national newspaper, a sub-editor, and so actually she loves just crafting text,
Right.
Like that's very much like what the bit that she's exceptional at it. But it strikes me that it's coming from even though there might be an overlap of skills, it's coming from a slightly different place.
Yeah, I have no interest in that whatsoever. My passion is, and I have this every time I'm working on, you know, I'm helping right now Chip Theory Games with the rule book for Burn Cycle. Chip Theory Games are one of my favorite companies, love what they do. And as I'm sat there editing the rule book, I'm thinking, it's midnight, I really should go to bed. I feel awful. But I'm thinking, this rule book is going to get printed and it's going to get into people's hands, and they're going to read these rules for awareness, and they're going to look at the examples that I've written with the images that I've written, and they're going to go, I get that. And they are going to be able to play that game. And I know that. And that is pumping through my veins, which is why I can't sleep at night, because I'm like, but it's exciting. And this is why, you know, working on some of the, you know, Vital Lacerda, for example, right? Me and Vital have become friends over the years, and I'm now known as the people who, the person who writes his rule books, right? Well, prior to this, I was a fan of his games. I was a fan of Vital Lacerda's games before I even started working for him. So now we're in the situation where I'm lucky enough in a way, though it's not luck, I made my own luck, but, you know, I feel very happy about the fact that I'm now working directly with him, and we will be having arguments at 2 o'clock in the morning about whether something should be worth 2 points or 1 point. And he's like, you know, this is my life now, but I wouldn't change it for the world. Because if you'd have said to me 10 years ago, you're going to be, Paul, you're going to be writing Vital Lacerda's rule books, I'd be like, yeah, get away. You know, where do you get that from?
How would that happen?
So yeah, I have no interest in the actual technicalities of writing text or anything like that. It's because I'm coming from, people are going to get this rule book. and people are going to be able to learn how to play from the rulebook. So yeah.
Very interesting, very interesting. So then I guess that prompts another question from my point of view on this in terms of the role of the different people in the process, which I guess this is a good opportunity to get into that.
Yeah.
Should then the graphic design of the rulebook be managed more under, ideally, your watch? Because I think that raises, because the objective of the graphic design is to make the rulebook usable, but you don't obviously do the graphic design yourself.
Yeah.
In kind of Paul's ideal world of what is the best structure for tackling rulebook editing,
Yep.
would you have yourself as the boss of the rulebook graphic designer?
In an ideal world, I guess yes. But the way that it normally works is that I will work on the rulebook in Google Docs, right? I will work exclusively in Google Docs at the start, add images and add notes and add comments and everything else. Then it goes off to the graphic designer. However, I always want to be involved in that process. Okay. There is only, I think, maybe 2 rulebooks that I've worked on where I did the text and then it disappeared and I didn't see it again. Now that made me uncomfortable because it's my name as the editor. I wrote the text, and when that rulebook left me and went to graphic designer, who knows what they did? Because you're absolutely right. The actual layout and the graphic design is so important. You know, if that call out box is on the wrong page or in the wrong section, or they didn't bold the headings enough, or they used the wrong, you know, title for a particular section, so it looked like a subsection and it was actually a big new, you know, all that sort of stuff. Or worst case, the graphic designer goes, well, I couldn't fit these rules onto that page, so I've moved them onto page 23. No, you know, so as soon as a rulebook leaves my area and goes to a graphic designer, if I never see it again, that is not something that I choose to do. And in fact, all of the rule books that I'm working on right now, whilst I'm not in charge of the graphic designer is, you know, working for the publisher and they're working to their things. I'm involved in that process. So I will be able to say, you know, I won't be able to say, change the font, I don't like it. It's horrendous. But I will be able to say that the arrow on that image is not clear. It needs to be pointing a bit more this way and things like that, because images and examples, I want to see the entire rulebook holistically as a product, and not just the words in it, but also the examples, where things are, and everything else. So yeah, I do like to be involved in that final bit.
Well, it makes a tremendous amount of sense, because the layout to me seems like it is equally important to the text. Like if you have the layout, if you just had the text and the layout is very poor, or the layout can actually surely detract from the text by implying things that are are wrong in terms of understanding
I've seen some. There was a rule book which somebody linked, because I'm known now for being the rulebook guy. People tag me in on Facebook posts when they've read a bad rulebook. They just go, "Oh, I've just read a rulebook for such and such a game. It was really awful. Shame they didn't hire Paul Grogan." Now that is very, very flattering.
Yeah.
What it means is that my Facebook feed is like, "Oh, somebody's mentioned and suddenly my brain is like, oh, I must go and have a look at this rulebook now." And suddenly I'm now looking at a rulebook for a game that I have no interest in whatsoever. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, oh yeah. And one of the ones that I saw last month, and it was very, very simple. It doesn't matter how good the text is. They'd gone with a 2-column approach because it's an A4 or letter size rulebook, which is fine. That's normal. But what they'd done is they broke the sections up vertically, but didn't have dividers in between the sections. So you were reading down the left column as you do, and then when you finish the left column, you switch to the right column. But actually what they'd done is you go down the left column, and then that actually continues about a third of the way down the page. That's the end of that section, and then it continues on the right column of that top. And it was like, it was almost unreadable. You just could not follow it. And that was simply, and I'm going to be rude here, it was an unskilled graphic designer who just copied and pasted the text into InDesign, changed it to 2 columns, split it up into the various sections, but didn't actually think through putting graphical dividers between the sections. So you were reading it and it just didn't flow properly. And that's nothing to do with the structure of the rulebook. The guy who did the text fine. That was fine. But when it goes to layout, it was just, yeah, it was a nightmare. Yeah.
Because this is, to me, not that different to the way that graphical user interface design works in software.
Yeah.
Which is that you have to make it navigable as your first priority. And obviously there are certain conventions about how we read books. The way that we read them is that we read one column and then the next column. And if you work against that convention, then it's going to it's not going to work. It's going to be very hard to navigate.
Yeah.
So there's got to be a really exceptional reason when you break those conventions. And it strikes me that this is a real problem. All right, so then that's interesting. The other part of this, though, and I remember we've had a couple of conversations about this previously, that there is also a boundary which seems to be somewhat soft to me between the rulebook usability and then the usability of aspects of the game as well.
Yes.
Like, for example, iconography.
Yes.
Which I know is something we've discussed in some games that you've worked on.
Yeah.
So what role do you think the rulebook editor can proactively play inputting into iconography and user interface design of game board elements, for example?
Generally speaking, none.
Okay.
Generally speaking, right? If you were wanting to design a game and you needed a rule book and you went onto these social media forums and said, recommend me some rulebook editors, and you find one and you hire them as a rulebook editor, you're going to get rulebook editing. That's what you're going to get. And a lot of rulebook editors would not feel comfortable if they were looking at a rulebook and looking at a game and they went, oh, these icons aren't very clear. They're not going to say anything because they've been hired to be a rulebook editor. Yeah. And if you hired a third party to be a rulebook editor and you didn't know them and they would, it's like hiring a guy to come around and paint your wall, and he went, that set of hanging baskets you've got there. Yeah, well, they don't really look. And you're like, look, mate, just paint the wall, right? I'll give you your money and you disappear. Now, I'm in the fortunate position that I can't keep my mouth shut. And the people I work with know that I can't keep my mouth shut. So I'm a little different. If I see icons that aren't clear, I say something because I can't not. But I don't expect other rulebook editors to do that. And I'm very sorry if you're a rulebook editor and you're listening to this and you do comment on iconography where you think it's not clear. Yeah, great. And please do that, because to be honest, if I was in the position of the designer of the game or anything else, I want that feedback. What I don't want is I don't want people to think, oh, I think there's a problem here, but it's not my position to say something, so I'm not going to say something, right? I'm always, this is one reason why I no longer have a full-time job and I'm employed by somebody else, is I will always speak my mind. And I will always, say when I think something is wrong or could be improved. And thankfully, going back to Vital, me, Vital Lacerda and Ian O'Toole gets all of the credit for all of the iconography and all of the graphic design on the game. And to be honest, he deserves 95% of it. Yeah. But then there's me and a couple of other people going, oh, that one would look better if you just move that little bit to the right and added a bit more fading on it. And oh yeah, I'll do that. So it's all a big shared team effort. But as far as your question about iconography being usable, you could have the best rule book in the world, but if your iconography is not clear, or things are just not in the right place on the board, people are going to they'll read the rule book and they'll be like, right, I now know how to play, and then they'll come to play it and they'll be like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't intuitive. I'm doing something over here, and it's actually affecting something over the other side of the board. Well, and people like me and you will be looking at that and going, well, why didn't they just put that track next to this one?
Yeah, exactly.
And things like that. Or why isn't there an up arrow icon here, reminding you that whenever you do something in this area, the share price goes up by 1, or something like that. And it's little things like that. And as I say, for me, because I can't keep my mouth shut, but also I am a game developer. I do game development for some companies.
Right. Yeah.
So I find it very difficult when I've got that sort of thing to suggest. So I always make sure if somebody hires me as a rulebook editor, I say, are you okay with me making any suggestions about the gameplay of the game? Or would you like me to just not say anything and just edit the rulebook? And always they say, no, if you've got any thoughts on it, let us know.
Okay, interesting.
So I always do, but I usually check beforehand.
Yeah, that makes a tremendous amount of sense that you would check beforehand, because I can see that some people would feel
Yeah.
They're very precious, right? I mean, and that
Mhm.
can't be something which you're a stranger to.
Nope.
People getting very precious about things being done in a very particular
Yeah.
way. That's been my experience in general, working with lots of different people who are designers, especially. They can get very precious about some things, and they're not prepared always to give up on their not so great ideas.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, you've had the experience of working with some of the top designers in board games in general. Do they tend to be sometimes a bit precious, or do they tend to be pretty good at giving up on some of their worst ideas?
It depends on the person.
Okay, interesting.
It depends on the person. And the other thing as well is confrontation always makes me uncomfortable. I am not good with confrontation, right? Having confrontational discussions about rules of a game. I mean, confrontational is probably the wrong word, but it's disagreements.
It's like forthright disagreement, right?
Yeah,
I guess is one way to put it.
With people who I'm a fan of. And let's go. Let's say Vlaada Chvatil, let's say Vital Lacerda, let's say Richard Breeze. These are heroes in the game industry. These are well-known popular designers. And I'm having arguments with them sometimes. It's like, and it makes me feel really uncomfortable. But again, I speak my mind and I say something. And some of the great thing is that, and the reason why I carry on doing it is because I feel that I have helped. Even if I say, I've played the game a couple of times, I don't like the way these work, it feels a bit unthematic, etc. I'll have that, and they'll go, "What are you talking about, Paul? You don't know what you're on about, this, that, and the other." And I'll be like, "Right, that's fine. I've said my bit, and they've said no for whatever reason." But sometimes they go, "Oh yeah," and the change gets made. And that's why I keep on doing it. I don't win all of the arguments, but going back to the 2 a.m. conversation with Vital Lacerda, this is a classic. This is from about 2 years ago. But there was a particular part of On Mars, and it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and there I was in bed on the iPad, and we were having this back and forth about this particular thing. And I felt he was getting a little bit angry. He probably wasn't. He was probably just tired and the language barrier and things like that. And I was reacting to that. And then we just agreed to, call it a night because it's 3 o'clock in the morning and we'll go to bed, we'll sleep on it. I got up the next morning, there was a message from him to say, "Paul, I've had a think about it and you're right. We're going to go with your change to the rule." And it's like, right, now I don't win all of my arguments with Vital, but that's why I persist, because sometimes I'm onto something. And sometimes I can make the designer look at it again and think about it from a different angle and then review it. So again, we're talking about different roles here. It is not normally the role of a rulebook editor to be having those kind of discussions with the designer, but I'm fortunate in that the position that I'm in, especially with Vital, who I've been working with now for like 5 years, this is just how we work together. That's just how it is. And we're doing exactly the same now on Weather Machine. And one of my rule suggestions that I put in about 3 weeks ago, he liked the idea of it. He's made that change. But then he said, unfortunately, I've now had to add 5 more components to the game. And we now need a way of tracking whether the component is face up or face down. But that change got made into the game. And and this is the thing with most of the games I've worked on, I can look at the game and I can look at a little bit of it and go, "Oh, that was me, that bit." On Tzolk'in, on the, oh God, which wheel is it? One of the wheels of Tzolk'in, the last space on one of the wheels, there's a not equals to sign. That's my not equals to sign.
Oh, right? Fantastic.
Because I said, and this is going back a long time now, I said, I think that is too powerful if you allow a player to move up on the same god track twice with that action. And they all thought about it and they went, "Yeah, you're right." And they put a not equals to sign on it. And
and then that makes it clear in the game that you can't do that, basically.
It's 2 different god tracks. Yeah.
Right.
And it's little things like that. And that, if we go back to my passion for games, this is why I carry on doing what I'm doing. Because it's so rewarding. And it's the unsung heroes. I mean, you've got it with Mage Knight. You are the designer of Mage Knight, but how many people have you been working with over the last couple of years on that project that have influenced some of the rules to make them better in one way or the other.
I'll count countless. I think
Exactly.
the thing is, it's already the case because it's quite a complex project. It's already the case that when I look at the credits for it, it's like the end of a Marvel movie.
Yeah.
Like a little bit already. But actually, if I included all of the people that have contributed in some way by just having a bright idea or at a playtest or something, it really would be like the end of a Marvel movie with like all the technical credits of the massive SFX team and things like that. It would be. Yeah, you're completely, the team effort thing is fascinating. Would you say then that it would probably repay rulebook editors in general to have a bit of developer experience?
Well, it's helped me because it's helped me see things from a different angle. And it's like going back to graphic designers, right? There's graphic designers and there's graphic designers who are gamers. And if you are going to get a graphic designer to do the layout of your rulebook, try to get somebody who is a gamer, because the end product will be far better, right? Because they're a gamer. They've read rulebooks. They know how example images work. They know, oh yeah, we need an image of a card and we need an arrow pointing to the bottom bit of text and we need to draw a circle around. They know that. Whereas I've worked with some graphic designers who are not gamers and it was painful. Because their graphic design skills are good, but they don't actually know. So in one case, I literally had to create my own images for them in Photoshop, right? Very rough images, and say, look, this is the image we need. Go and make it look nice.
Yeah.
And all it was here's a picture of a card with an arrow pointing to where the armor is.
Right. Yeah. Completely.
And saying, for example, this unit has 4 armor. They weren't able, I mean, they were a bit stubborn, but I've seen other rule books done by people who were graphic designers who aren't rulebook people. And it's just, so yeah, I think having multiple hats, having multiple angles, all helps the situation. And again, you mentioned that I demo games at conventions, and I do a lot of that. I do a lot of teaching games in person to people. That helps the rulebook writing skill.
Yeah,
creating the videos helps the rulebook writing. All of the different aspects of my job all feed into each other. And they're all, I mean, all of them are all around teaching games. So there is definitely a complementary element to each part of the job.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense. Again, kind of bringing it back to what you said about being an editor in all caps, because actually that is about that kind of total view of how games are taught. So in general then, do you think rule books are getting better or not? I mean, obviously outside of your rule books, obviously you put the tremendous effort into making them really excellent, but I'm thinking about it from this very holistic perspective. But is that true in general? The rule books are getting better? Yes and no. Interesting.
It is a really interesting one. And I have multiple things to say about this, because some people think that a bad rule book will kill a game. And there's been evidence of that, right? There has been evidence of games that could have been huge, popular, amazing games, but the rule book was so bad, it was such a barrier to entry, people just weren't able to actually play it, right? And there's a couple which I don't know whether I should mention them or not, but people probably know which ones I'm talking about. And then there are other games that come out with bad rule books, but are hugely popular and sell millions. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. People have said that the Terraforming Mars rulebook isn't that good. Okay, now the Terraforming Mars rulebook is okay. It's not good. Well, maybe it's good, but it's not great. It's certainly not the best rulebook I've read. But Terraforming Mars has sold millions. The state of the rulebook for that game has not held back the sales of the game at all.
Interesting.
Whereas there are other games where the reputation of the rulebook absolutely condemned the game to the bargain bin within 6 months. And it's fascinating how you get these things, because you're like, oh, well, there's the evidence. There's the evidence that rule books, right, they've got to be good, otherwise this happens. And then you get other games that come out with not good rule books that still seem to do well. There's also, what's very interesting is what the Spiel des Jahres committee said, not last year, but the year before, which when I read it, I tell you what, I had a naked dance around the garden. I was so, because the Spiel des Jahres committee for those people who don't know, the Spiel des Jahres is the German Game of the Year award. In our hobby or industry of awards, this is the most prestigious one. Now, the Spiel des Jahres award generally goes to what the committee feel is the best overall game, and it is very much weighted towards family games. It didn't used to be, but it is now, and that's fine. But they made a statement, and they said that if your rule book for your game is not of a good enough quality, we are not going to consider it for the Spiel des Jahres award. And I was jumping for joy, because I can bang on about how rule books need to be better, and it makes nobody listens, nobody cares, right? There's a publisher out there who's going, well, we don't care about Paul Grogan, we're not going to listen to what he says, right? But the Spiel des Jahres committee saying it, suddenly publishers have to pay attention. Now,
suddenly there's pressure,
pressure.
Right? It's applying a pressure that means that if potentially you make a crappy rule book, then you for 100% know your game isn't getting nominated.
Yes. Now, if you've designed, Mage Knight, for example, is never going to get nominated for the Spiel des Jahres. That's just, that's just how it is, because it doesn't fit into that category.
It doesn't. No, it doesn't.
So for example, you don't need to worry about that. In terms of, I've got to make sure my rule book's good. If you've designed a 5-hour heavy complex Euro game, you go, I've got to make sure my rule book's good. Otherwise the Spiel des Jahres committee are not going to look at it. No, they're not going to look at it anyway. But yeah, so in some respects, rule books are getting better. There are a number of publishers who have over the years improved their rule books. Now, in my opinion, they should have done it sooner. In my opinion, if you are a publisher and you've spent a year in the industry and you've made 3 games and all of your rule books haven't been good, you need to do something.
Yeah.
Some of those publishers took 4 or 5 years before they eventually caved in and decided to start improving their rule books, because you can. It's just time, it's the right people, and it's money. That's what it takes to do a good rule book. And some publishers have, and some publishers have been doing better and better rule books. Other publishers haven't. Other publishers are still producing rule books which are mediocre at best, and that's disappointing to see. But there are some other publishers who are still out there producing awful rule books and are showing no signs of even wanting to improve. And Kickstarter is a whole separate thing, but there are so many games that come out on Kickstarter with, well, look at this artwork, look at these minis.
Right, yeah.
Oh, look, it's just made 1.5 million, funded in 9.3 seconds. And then the game comes out and the rulebook's terrible. And the game sold, it made 500,000 or more. And I can see why, because if you put a Kickstarter up for a game and when this game contains a really good rulebook, right, it's not going to fund. But if you say, look at these fancy minis, look at these nice artwork and all of this, that's what sells. So a good rule book isn't going to sell your game, but it is going to make it, because if you've got if you've spent 3 years designing a game and you've got these miniatures and you've got this artwork and you've got a brilliant game and you've got 100 scenarios and you make 2 million on Kickstarter, right? Fantastic. From a business point of view, you can buy your helicopter and you're happy. But the game then gets out there on people's shelves and all of the backers get it and nobody's playing it.
No.
Now, for me, I'm not a games designer. I'm not a publisher. Of course, I'd want to make 1 million and buy a helicopter, but I'd also want my game to be sat on people's gaming tables and being played.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So as a designer, I would hate the fact that I've spent 2 or 3 years designing a game and it's out there and nobody's playing it, not because the game's bad, but because they can't learn how to play the game.
Well, ultimately, you've not made a game, you've just made a collector's object.
Right.
Right, at that point.
Yeah,
so,
until a fan comes out and rewrites the rulebook for you, which will happen.
Well, and that's really interesting, isn't it? So the first thing is that, that makes total sense to me. What we're saying is that rulebooks are more like a hygiene factor, in the sense that they aren't necessarily the thing that will move the needle from a commercial perspective. And in fact, you've got these really interesting examples of, you've got games which have been terrible rulebooks, but still been very successful.
Yes.
But if that might be that they're very successful in spite of their bad rulebooks. Yeah. And it could easily be that actually if the rulebooks had also been good, it's quite possible those games might have been even more successful, right? Because actually what drove their success was something else.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, and this, to me, I mean, this question of, it has to be good because you want to reduce the friction for people to play it.
Yeah, the barrier to entry is the rule book.
And it doesn't, I mean, this is the problem, I guess. It's very hard to prove commercially, but I would have expected that the more people that learn your game more quickly and play it more quickly, the more quickly that they tell other people to play it.
Yeah.
And the kind of slow motion viral pattern that all board games follow would just be accelerated, right? Wouldn't it?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, one of the rule books that I've been working on for the last 6 months is Batman Gotham City Chronicles.
Right, yeah.
Games.
Yeah.
And I hope they don't mind me talking about this, but the rule book for that game was not very well received. And that is the classic example of a game which made a huge amount of money on Kickstarter. And I know dozens and dozens of people, if not hundreds of people, who have this game. They backed it on Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And they tried playing it and they failed to learn how to play from the rulebook, and they put it back in the box. And I know this because I am now a member of the Batman Gotham City Chronicles Facebook groups, and I have been for the last 6 months, and people know I've been working on the rulebook, and that's how many people have told me. We have this game, Paul. We've got this game. We bought it. We tried playing it. We couldn't decipher the rulebook. We put it back in the box, but now we know there's going to be a new rulebook. We'll wait, and when the new rulebook comes out, and it's really interesting from a company point of view, because what Monolith have done is they've hired me to basically completely and utterly rewrite their rulebook. Sure, they're going to be going on Kickstarter and launching they're going to launch it again, and they've realized they need a better rulebook in order to do that. But they also want the people who've already bought the game to be able to play it, because they made the money from it. They're now reinvesting that money back in. Now, they didn't need to. They could have said, right, Batman, let's just write that game off, right? That we made it. It made us loads of money. People can't play it apart from the fans that have really invested the time and effort, but let's just leave it there. But they didn't. They've gone back in and said, no, we need to actually support this game and do that. So that, that's one aspect of it, because sometimes a publisher will just step away from a game and write it off, and it's finished, and then then they're done with it. So yeah, it's that barrier to entry, and I've had this now, 15 years ago, or maybe even 10 to 15 years ago. If I got a game that I was like, oh, this looks like a kind of game that I'd like, and we start reading it and like, oh no, this rule book's really bad and I can't work out this, and this doesn't make sense, and this is contradictory and whatever, I would spend days of my life browsing the forums, talking to other people, asking questions and everything else. I'd put in all of that effort. I'd then create my own FAQ. I'd then create player aids with, and I'd do that all so I could play the game, because that's the kind of person I am. Now my impatience, my tolerance for bad rule books has gone down. If I now get a game like that and I start reading the rule book now, and if within an hour I'm like, and I'm not saying, oh, I'm very sorry, but the structure of this rule book isn't good enough, I'm not going to even bother. I'm talking about, you start reading it, something's not explained, something contradicts something else, this isn't there, that's not there. I'm like, no, I'll tell you what, I'll go and play one of the other 300 games that I've got in my collection. I actually just don't bother now. So for me, a bad rule book is a barrier to entry and would stop me playing the game.
So do you think this has been, then your job to some extent has been an influence over your changing kind of tastes in games over time?
Absolutely. Because I have more respect as a gamer for the publishers who take the time and effort to do things as I think they now should have done, rather than just the people who put in minimal effort and just hope that that will be okay. It's like, no, I've no time for them, and I've no time for their games now. And even if people say, oh yeah, the game's great, you just really need to spend a week learning it and browsing, when the FAQ is bigger than the actual original rule book.
Oh god,
fans have rewritten the entire rule. I'm like, no, the publisher should have done that. And then you've got other publishers who are really going to every effort possible to make sure the rule book's good and all of that lot. Well, they're the ones that I want to be interested in.
Yeah, completely. Well, I mean, there's just so much that exists now. There doesn't seem like a tremendous reason to put that amount of effort in, because as you said, like there's so many other games that have done that job. They've kind of respected the customer in that sense, and then the game is also equally good.
Yes.
So why wouldn't you pick that game
Yeah.
rather than the one that's going to be a huge pain to learn?
Yeah.
This is very interesting. There was a piece of research on BGG that tried to work out whether or not rulebooks in general were getting better by the size of the FAQ threads, which is kind of like,
Nah.
I don't think, it doesn't sound like that would work in your view.
Because the number of users of BGG has gone up, the number of people using BGG has gone up, and if you look at some of the rule books, which are, in my opinion, extremely good rule books, there are pages and pages and pages of FAQ because people are lazy. And a lot of if you look at the rules forums for games which have really good rule books, generally the replies to those forums are, it's on page 17. Or, they will say, or it's because, and this is another interesting topic that I don't know if we want to go down this route, but there is a difference between a bad rule book and a complex game. And I know so many people.
I absolutely do want to go down this route, because that seems very critical to me, that the meeting point of actual rules and the rule book is just critical.
Yeah, there are so many people who will go, oh yeah, the rule book for game X is really bad.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no. The rule book for game X is an extremely good rule book. Everything is in there. There's no contradictions. It's in a good structure. There's no missing rules. It's all there. It's all fine. The game is just really complex. And therefore you are going to have a hard time learning how to play that game, even though the rule book's a good rule book.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's a complex game and you're going to make mistakes and you're going to forget things. But Great Western Trail, in my opinion, whilst the rulebook might not be perfect, it's one of the best rulebooks for a complex game I've read. I read the rulebook for Great Western Trail. I was then able to play Great Western Trail and teach other people how to play, and had no questions whatsoever in the game that weren't covered in the rulebook. Everything that cropped up in the game was in the rulebook. Therefore, that rulebook served its purpose. It taught me how to play the game, and I didn't have any questions afterwards. And there are pages and pages and pages of questions on there about, well, what happens if you do this? Well, that, it's in the rule book. It is there. It's not hidden. It's there in a big red box. So
a quantitative analysis wouldn't even help you solve that problem in terms of analyzing it, because of the problem that it's the nature of the replies. So it's all confounded by all of these issues of the more popular games will just have more responses.
Exactly.
People often don't even bother to look necessarily in the detail of the rule book to be like, oh, actually, this is even covered in a specific rulebook FAQ or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's basically not amenable to that kind of analysis, basically.
Even one of the rule books that I've written recently for a game which has just come out, backers have just got hold of a game which I worked on the rulebook for. I mean, I worked on the rulebook like months ago, but backers are now getting their copies of it. And one of them, some of them are Patreon supporters of mine, and he sent me a message through Slack. He said, I hope you don't mind, Paul, but I found a few missing things in the rulebook. And I said, well, please let me know, because I want to improve all of the time.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah. So the concept of, there's a few things that refer to the level of a card. Okay. And at no point do you actually mention anywhere in the rule book what the level of a card is or where it is. And I'm like, I'm panicking. And then later he came back to me and went, oh, no, it's all right. I found a big blue box right on the page that says, here's what the level of the card is. And I'm like, whew, right. But it's interesting because I'm trying to work out psychologically. When he was reading through it, he didn't see that blue box. He didn't see that big box saying this is the level of a card. And that's exactly the kind of question you'll get on BGG. Is somebody will go, oh, I've done this ability and it says that I score 2 points per level of my yellow cards. What is the level of a card? And some of the replies will be, it's in the blue box on page 11. And they'll go, oh yeah. And that's it. The rule book was fine. It was there. It was just some people miss it.
So most probably, if there was anything that could have been improved about it, it would be something around the graphic design, probably of how it was positioned. Maybe. Yeah.
Call out boxes are a difficult thing to get right because some people mentally ignore them.
Yeah.
But you can't interrupt your flow of text with side information. It's a tricky thing to get right. But yeah.
I think that's something I've noticed quite a bit in terms of reading things, is that I tend to, if anything feels like it's sort of like additional notes or you might like to know, my brain just goes, nope, and just ignores it. And it has to be something that's like a red with like a strong icon on it or something that's like, do not skip this.
Yeah.
Tends to be the only thing that I will pick up. So that's very interesting. Considering that. Well, I mean, the question of complex games versus rule books raises an immediate question for me, and it's one that I've thought about a lot during the development of Mage Knight, is that are there just some rules that are just simply less amenable to explanation?
Yes, and I'm working on one this morning. And he's driving me crazy. And I'm trying to convince the publisher to change the rule. And I had a discussion with them at about 10 o'clock last night, and they said they're not going to change the rule because it causes balance issues. So unfortunately, it's a very difficult concept. And I said, well, this might end up with an entire page of examples to explain this particular concept in this game. And they said, well, that's your job, Paul. Here's the rule. You now need to explain this as clear as possible. How you do that is up to you. And I've gone, oh, right, okay. And it's one of those ones where if I was sat with you right now and I had the board in front of you, I could say, look, this piece here, you see, it moves to here, and then there's this. Right, I can't do that in a rule book.
No.
Right?
No.
I have to do it with still images and text. And it's a concept which I'm wrangling with this afternoon.
So that's an interesting subtlety, isn't it? So there's the question of, is the rule just difficult to explain?
Yeah.
There's the question of, is the rule difficult to explain in the given medium? So for example, in a text document. And then there's the rule of, is the rule just poorly expressed and the expression of it can be improved?
I don't know how I'm going to solve this one, because when you're demoing a game to somebody in person, I can use analogies, right? So I can be saying to you, look, James, if I move this piece over here, and I move through this here, then it's just like the doors in Star Trek, right, great. I can't do that in a rule book.
Right, yeah. It's a bit like this. Think about this. Imagine that, in this TV show where this happens.
So, yeah, you can the freedom of expression when doing a physical playthrough, where you can act things out, you can use hand movements, you can move things around, you can do all of that, you can use analogies, is great. And explaining a concept within a game, so it's a tricky thing, because I don't personally believe that flavor text within the main body text of a rule book is a good thing to do. Flavor text, when it's in a little side bit, in a different font, in italics or whatever, great. But flavor text mixed in with actual rules is not something that I want to see. I want to keep my flavor text to the side. But that does mean I can't start using flowery flavor text to describe this particular situation. And if I did, it would actually make it easier. So I'm at the moment, I'm explaining the rule, and then in brackets, I'm putting a thematic explanation of the rule. So it's not quite flavor text, but it is a thematic explanation for the rule, but it's in brackets at the end of the sentence.
Interesting.
And that's, it's...
That's a kind of an unusual midway point, because I know when we were editing Mage Knight, we end up just differentiating, here's the flavor text, it's in a different font, it's very clearly different, versus the kind of technical nature of the rules text.
Yeah.
I guess the problem is that the rules text has to be technical, because there has to be a definitive way to read it.
Yeah.
There can't be a kind of multiple approximate set of interpretations, like it's a poem or something. Like that's not what you can do. It has to be very clear what exactly is meant.
Yeah.
But the problem is that actually, in terms of explanation, the thing I always find in terms of teaching games in general is that without thematic and analogy, everything is much more complicated, which is why rulebook editing is difficult, right?
Yeah.
Because it requires you to be technical about something that if you're verbally explaining, you can work by analogy.
Yeah.
I mean, if I think about the way that you teach games, you have a very clear method for this. It's very different. Yeah. It isn't like reading a rulebook out for absolutely sure. It's nothing like that.
No.
So, and just yesterday, I was talking to Jai about this, about the fact that I find it difficult when people try and explain games to me who are not used to explaining games, because what they do is they tend to say, well, in the game, you move the piece from here to here, and then you can draw one of these cards, and that's where they start.
Yeah, and you're like, whoa. Is this a cooperative game? What are we trying to do?
Yeah.
How does it last for 10 rounds, or does it last when a marker reaches?
Yeah.
Tell me that first.
And they're like, oh yeah, it's a game about defeating a horde of invading robots. Yeah, and I'm like, right.
Now we know.
I need to know that first before we can go into the technical
That is similar in rule books in terms of structure. You have to start with what the game's about.
Yeah.
Then you have to start with I mean, I always like to start with a little bit of flavor introduction. So a couple of paragraphs in italics of setting the theme of the game. It's the year 3000, whatever. Then I like to have a couple of paragraphs about what the game is. This is a cooperative game for 2 to 5 players where you are trying to do this, etc., etc. The game will last for, 4 rounds. And then at the end of the 4 rounds, if your walls are still standing, you win the game. Right. Okay. So we've had the thematic flavor. Then we've had the precise detail. And straight away, right, I know what the game is, I know how you win, and I know roughly how long it's going to last. And then we start diving into, here's the list of components, here's the setup. So in that respect, the teaching person will follow a similar structure because you start off with the high level and then you start going down into the detail. But one of the things that I've been doing recently, and some people won't like this, but this is a style choice. If, for example, a game has a number of rounds, and in each round there are 3 phases, and in phase 1, everybody draws 2 cards from a deck, right? So that's dead simple. In phase 2, all players take an action, and then in phase 3, you do cleanup. Okay, right? So the structure of the game is very simple, 3 phases. I want to explain the overall structure of the game with those 3 phases first. When I start describing phase 2, if there are 10 different actions that you can do, I'm not going to explain them at that point in the rulebook.
Yeah.
All I'm going to say in the rulebook is in phase 2, you will perform 1 of 10 actions. The actions are all explained, maybe even in the appendix.
Yeah.
Literally, I'm not going to put them in the middle of the rulebook because at that point in the rules, I want players to read, okay, phase 1, draw cards, phase 2, perform an action, phase 3, do cleanup. Right, that's in my head.
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt and say, phase 2, you perform 1 of 10 actions. Right, I'm now going to spend 6 pages talking about those 10 actions. And then 7 pages later go, phase 3, cleanup. It's like, what? No, because by the time you've got to that page of the rule book, you've forgotten that you're in a 3-phase structure. So
I wonder, that's really interesting from the perspective of how rule books meet how people mentally file things. Because it's almost like that's a bit like what you end up with is something which is more usable when it's like a fractal pattern, where there's this thing of like, first step is you have the structure of the game, and that gives you a way to understand, okay, the overall, it's played in a series of repeating rounds, and each round is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and I've suddenly got a superstructure. Before I know anything else about the game, I'm sitting about to play the game, and I've got a sense of how my turn arc will be.
Yes.
And then you're next saying, right, well, we're not going to tackle what the 10 actions you can do in phase 2 are yet. We will have a set, when we get to that, we will explain that in due course.
Yeah.
And that reflects a little bit, I think, how people file information,
right,
is what it seems to be. And I guess that's partly what the art of writing a good rule book is, right? It's reflecting the way that information is filed.
Yes.
But at the same time remaining completely unambiguous.
Yeah.
Which a metaphorical approach can't do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the amount of sentences of rules I've written, which have then gone to other people and they've read it a different way. I mean, I read a rule yesterday and it was quite funny actually, because I was on the Discord channel where all of the playtesters are. And I read this rule and it said, put a token on either side of the wall. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And they said, but Paul, you need to mention that because there's only 3 tokens in the game, you can only do that a maximum of 3 times.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? I'm putting a token on either side of the wall.
Yeah.
So that's 2 tokens. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how can I, if there's only, surely I need 6 tokens. And they went, no. You put a token on either side of the wall. I went, oh,
as in both.
Yeah, I was reading it as both, whereas they were. Oh. Now I was the only person who interpreted that line as put a token on both sides of the wall.
Oh, interesting.
Everybody else, and it could have been because I didn't have much sleep on Wednesday night.
Yeah.
But everybody else interpreted as put a token on either side of the wall, and I interpreted it
or the other.
Yeah, and I interpreted it as put it on both sides of the wall.
Right, interesting. Yeah.
And now, as I say, I was the only one that made that misinterpretation, but that meant I had to say, and I just changed the word either to one side of the wall, brackets, it doesn't matter which.
Yeah, right. I see. Yeah, because that's unambiguous.
Because if you put one side of the wall, players will go, well, which side of the wall?
Yeah.
So you have to say one side of the wall, and then I felt I needed to add the text to say it doesn't actually matter which side of the wall you put the token on.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting how many people will read, as you say, a rule needs to be precise and clear and unambiguous. And I've had this with rules I've written. I've written it and I've gone, yeah, that's clear. You know, a couple of years ago, I learned a lot about the word any. So if I say to you, James, right, there's a barrel in the corner. There's a barrel in the corner there. It's filled with apples. Go over there and get me any apple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you going to get me one? Or are you going to get me? The word any is ambiguous.
Oh, there are lots of situations in which I found this. Yes, where well, effectively, because it doesn't exactly mean all, but it can kind of mean all in certain situations, right?
Any could mean all in some circumstances.
Get me any, exactly, rather than, oh, yeah,
absolutely. So I now say, go over there and get me any one apple.
Yes, because then it's unambiguous.
It's unambiguous. And it's funny because another rule book that I wrote went to the backers a couple of weeks ago for feedback. And one of the backers came back and suggested removing the word one from that line because taking any one token is clear. And I went, no, it's not.
No.
And that's exactly why. But it's interesting that I'd gone the extra mile and I'd put take any one token. And one backer in particular read it and said, you don't need to use the word one because by saying take any token, that infers, and I'm like, no. Language is easily misinterpreted, and we haven't even touched on translation issues.
Oh my God. Well, I'm actually going to say, I had a whole set of questions on translation, but I'm going to park those for now.
Yeah.
Because I'm really hoping that obviously we'll get a chance to do this again. Yeah. So that's one of the ones we can
do part 2 next time.
Oh, absolutely. The thing I really wanted to get into that I'm really, really excited to get your opinion on, because it's a passionate area for me, is around the role of evolving how we teach games.
Right.
In particularly around the development that we've seen in the last few years of tutorials.
Yes.
So you know that I have put one into Mage Knight.
Absolutely.
I did something which I've recently been playing with Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, and I've been going through the tutorial to that, and I'm thinking that. I first came across it several years back with Fog of Love, which had one. So where are we going with this? Are rule books in the current form going to be obsolete at some point?
No.
Okay.
No, we're going to still have rule books, but the number of games that are now using a walkthrough, first game, read this first, demo, whatever, is brilliant. And so different ones have done it different ways. There are ways to do it where it is literally scripted. So you've got like a 4-page read this first booklet, and it says, right, set up the game. Now, this player, and I've just actually done something like this a couple of weeks ago. Me and a friend of mine got the Middle Earth collectible card game from 1995. Right? This is a really, really old card game.
Wow.
Now, one of the problems with that game is it was very, very inaccessible because the rulebook was really, really complicated. And we found that in, I think, 98 or 99, the company who made it released what's called a starter set for the game. It was the last thing they released before the game then got cancelled, because it was just prior to the films coming out, at which point they didn't have the license anymore. Okay, so that's why the game got wrapped up. But anyway, we found a starter set and we were playing it, and we managed to find the starter set walkthrough that came with the game. And it was 100% scripted. Literally, even down to the dice rolls.
Wow, interesting.
So it told you to stack your decks in a certain order. It then talked you step by step through all of the phases of the game and told you, right, at this point, you need to draw 2 cards. You have now drawn this card. Notice that your opponent has just moved through a wilderness, so you should play this card on them. They then choose to fight the spiders. They roll dice. They rolled a 7. So this is what happens. Right, and what me and a friend of mine did is we played through this entire game on Tabletop Simulator, following the scripted walkthrough. We made 0 choices whatsoever. Right? We literally just followed what we were doing, reading from the book and going through the steps and moving the cards around. And by the end of it, we knew how to play the game.
Yeah.
Okay. That was the best way to learn that game.
Yeah.
And that was 100% scripted with no player decisions. Now, Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion has done it slightly differently. What it's done is it's split the learning up into your first 5 scenarios. It teaches you the basic rules and then says, right, off you go and play them. Then it teaches you the next bit of rules and says, now go and play them. So it is giving you the choice. You feel that you're playing the game.
Yeah.
But any game that uses that kind of approach, for me, gets a thumbs up. And I know you've done it with Mage Knight, because some people will not need that. Some people will read the rule book and go, right, I now know how to play the game, and they'll go and play it. And other people will want to sit down with your walkthrough manual and go through that step by step. And so what you've done is you have reduced the barrier to entry to your game, and that's got to be a good thing. But how much time and effort did it take?
Oh God, it was a monstrous amount of time. It was months and months of development work in early of last year. It was absolutely brutal. It was the toughest single piece of design that I had to do in the entire process, probably.
And it was optional.
And it was optional because we didn't need to do it.
No.
But I felt that this is really interesting thinking about where tutorials might be applicable. It felt like Mage Knight has a couple of mechanics that I don't think they're horrendously difficult to understand, but they present enough of a barrier, I think, in themselves, that even a rulebook explanation of them, they're the kind of thing where you'd read a page and go, okay, yeah, and then you play it and you go, oh, I see it now. Yeah. But until you've seen it played, you'll probably think being a bit of a head scratcher.
Exactly.
So to being able to demonstrate that and get that over. Also, I just aware that so many games, we saw before, they're sitting on people's shelves for so long, and I know that the fact that I have to read a rule book first before I can just start playing makes me slightly less likely to play something every time. And that just thinking, you know what, I could get the new game, I could unseal it, and then begin playing it with my friends straight away without any prep, just seems like a very attractive prospect to me. And I guess to the slightly wider circle of people. Because one of the things I'm really aware of is that, if you spend a lot of time on BGG or a lot of time in the industry, by their nature, most people have heavier skewing tastes, and they're super tolerant of reading rule books, and they're super tolerant of that sort of thing because they have to do it. But if I'm with people who are more casual, they're the kind of people that don't play many board games, play Mage Knight, they instantly recognize elements of it. They're like, oh, it's a bit like Monopoly. And actually, they're making strategic decisions before the end of their first game. So it's like, it's obviously not fundamentally too difficult for them to learn and play and get a lot out of, even though it's a pretty big looking game. But I just felt like I want to get people to that point so rapidly, right? And
it's interesting because, as you say, the board game hobby that we know, every board gamer that I know, I'll say every, 90% are on BGG. Right? What percentage of gamers in the world are on BGG? Not many.
A few percent.
Probably. Right, exactly. Because if we're talking about the untapped, well, not the untapped market, but the market of family games, the Ticket to Ride, the Catans, the Codenames, 90% of the people who buy those games have never heard of BGG.
No, they have no idea what it is.
They need a rule book. It's like, oh, I've bought this game. The last game I bought was, Monopoly Exeter. And if that rule book, if they bought Mage Knight, without your walkthrough book, they would take one look at the rule book, they'd start to read it, and it would go back in the box. However, the walkthrough booklet, they'll be like, oh, okay, right. And I think what would be great is if they say to their friends, oh, we've got this new game. It looks a bit more complicated than Monopoly, but come round. It's got one of these walkthroughs. We can sit down, we can try it, and we will know at the end of that whether this is a kind of game that we're going to like or not. So it reduces not only the barrier to them learning how to play the game, it reduces the barrier to them even trying the game out, because there's a few people I know, the few people that I know in the world though who are not gamers, they're a bit scared. It's not just, oh, I can't be bothered learning it. It's, oh, that's too hard work. And that's for people who play those games. And I'm not good enough for that. And if you can just make the game approachable and say, look, you'll be fine, then that's good.
Completely. Well, this is my sincere hope for it, is that it takes the form of a deck, actually. It's like a deck of tarot-sized cards that hopefully will do that. How many games are you seeing that are coming your way in terms of editing work that have a tutorial element to them?
Oof.
Is it still quite small, or is it?
It is quite small.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is quite small, and I think I need to be starting to recommend it more.
Interesting.
Because going back to what we were saying earlier on, when people hire me to be a rulebook editor, they get all of my other stuff bundled in that.
Yeah,
and I
exactly.
think what I need to be doing is I need to be saying to people, have you considered some kind of, tutorial or walkthrough for this game? I mean, I haven't even considered it for Weather Machine. I'm working on the Weather Machine rulebook right now with Vital Lacerda, and I haven't even considered that. And I don't know if I should.
Yeah,
because
it must be difficult to decide what are the right projects for it, right?
Yeah, because as you say, it's a huge amount of work, but also the target audience for Vital Lacerda's games, none of his other games have had walkthroughs or introductions, whereas Burn Cycle is going to have one. The other rulebook I'm working on at the moment for Chip Theory Games, Burn Cycle, is going to have in the back of the rulebook, and we're going to reference it at the start. If you want to just see how the game plays, here's like 4 or 6 pages at the back of the rulebook with, it's kind of like an example first turn, but it's actually more, it's going to be explaining what happens, explaining the different steps, and actually seeing it being played out. And I think the plan is to write it in such a way that you can physically set up the game to match the images and physically play through it,
just play it through,
and play it through just to see how it works out. A little bit maybe like the Middle Earth card game thing, where it is just literally we were moving the pieces around as the text told us to do so.
Yeah,
so
that's very interesting. And I guess the advantage of doing a book over, say, a deck of cards is that a book you can have those quite big graphical examples in.
Yeah,
because the biggest problem I think I faced on the deck of cards for this was that you had to just describe things really well, because obviously you couldn't have, there's a few pictures, but there's not a lot of space. You can't have a whole diagram. It obviously gave us other advantages because it meant we could do things like during the game when we're accelerating it, the scripting bit, everyone draws their own secret card from the deck and they know what actions they're going to perform over the next round and that sort of thing. So it's a bit more flexible in some ways. And if obviously it's nice it being bite-sized, like people don't feel like there's too much being explained at once. But certainly that's an interesting challenge there. It's a fascinating one picking them because the Vital Lacerda's games are I haven't, well, other than Escape Plan, which you taught me, of course, it must be almost 2 or 3 years back now. Yeah, exactly. Other than that, I've not played any of his other games. Right. Because to be completely honest, even though some of them look amazing, like the recent version of Kanban EV, I look at that and I'm like, oh, that looks up my street. But I am a little bit intimidated by them, to be completely honest. Even as someone who designs games that are not light, I look at them and I think, oh, you know what? If you just told me there was a tutorial, I would be much more on board with this than having to wade my way through the rule book, even when it's a very well written rule book. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Okay, well, we've been talking for quite a while already. We have. It's been, but the time has flown by. So before we, what I'd like to just is to move on before we end to some listener questions. Yes. So they got a chance to that, because I'm sure there's loads of other things we can talk about in future in another episode. I've got lots of people have sent me their questions. I'm sure lots of people are just as interested in picking your brains as I've been. So what I'm going to start with, I'm going to get the Jaffa Cake questions out of the way first. Right, okay. Because those are always the classic ones. The most important ones. Because at some point along the line, your love of Jaffa Cakes became something of a meme in the board game industry. But I'm obviously really keen to get into the more practical questions, where certainly publishers, aspiring game makers could learn a few kind of useful tips, that kind of thing. So the first question on Jaffa Cakes is, of course, are they cakes or are they biscuits? So they go hard when you leave them out in the open. I think that means they are cakes. Yes, I believe that was HMRC's ruling on them as well when it came to the VAT case on Jaffa Cakes. So that makes sense. And then the second question is, what are your thoughts on different flavors, e.g. cherry or lime? Right, so the cherry ones are amazing. The strawberry ones are good. The pineapple ones were better than I expected. The passion fruit ones, I had one of them and gave the rest. So not a strong vote for passion fruit. Well, well, I'm very glad I managed to ask you those questions. Yeah, I didn't. I've got both very direct, on-brand answers along with the very on-brand Jaffa Cake related questions. So the next question I'm going to move on straight to is about rulebooks, and the next one is: have you ever encountered a rulebook that needs such an overhaul that you just wanted to shred it to pieces instead? Yeah. Yes.
and have done so virtually. There are a few rulebooks which I have been a consultant on, where literally they said, Paul, we're going to pay you for 1 day of your time to read through our rulebook and then give us your honest evaluation. Okay. And on a couple of occasions, I have said, you need to start from square one. You need to start back at scratch, because the entire rulebook, every part of it is a disaster.
Wow.
The whole structure is a disaster. But as I read each individual section, it was in shorthand. Every section I wrote, every section I read was written from the point of view of, you already know how to play
almost
this game,
more like
and I'm just going to remind you of a rule in shorthand.
Than really being a rule book.
It was, well, it was in PDF. It had images, it had layout, right? But when you read it, it was like, yeah, so in the movement part of the turn, each player moves their figure across the board. Right, how many spaces? Well, equal to their move value, but it didn't say that. Can you move through other people? Oh yeah, you can move through them, but you can't end the space on them. Right, it didn't say that. It literally just had short notes. So there's been a couple of rule books I had like that. In fact, 3 in the last 6 months where I have provided 1 day's worth of consultancy work on them. All 3 of those were, you really need to start from scratch with this rule book again. So yeah, I have had that. I've also had ones where they gave me the job of editing, and the first thing I did was start a brand new document. Not even take the existing document and start moving it around, but actually start a brand new document and then start copying and pasting bits of text in and editing them as I went, because I felt that the structure just just wasn't there. So yeah, I've had that, and I've had other rule books where it literally just needed half a day's worth of proofreading and minor
thank you
grammar.
to Tom for that question, because that I think is quite illuminating again,
so,
in terms of just making how clear how varied the work is from the point of view of the very different processes you're applying to very different rule books, and what you get on the kind of input to that as well. John asks, what's a kind of red flag that a rule book is going to be really poorly written when you first encounter it? What's the kind of biggest red flag, I guess?
Those things that I just described. I normally get a fairly good impression early on. I mean, yeah, when I start reading through it, I will get an initial impression straight away, just from the way it's written. And I'm not talking here about language. If they're not using Oxford commas and there's the occasional spelling mistake, I don't care at this stage. I'm looking for the actual content in there. And it's a combination of things. It's a combination of too much information. Front loading is a big problem in rulebooks. We could, if we're going to do part 2 of this next month, front loading of information, we can have a whole half hour's discussion about that. But it's one of the big problems that I see in rulebooks, even ones that come out. But that is a red flag for me. Now, it's a red flag for me, and one of the rulebooks that I'm working on at the moment had 12 pages of front loading information before it then got into how to play the game. And I said to the publisher, how much editing permission are you giving me for this rule book? And they went, you have full control. And I went, thank you very much, because I'm going to remove that 12 pages of front loading information. I've now got it down to 2. Now, I don't like any front loading of information, but unfortunately this game, there are some very important concepts you needed to have early, but I have kept it to the bare minimum. But before that, it was literally 12 pages of here's loads and loads and loads of detail about very, very detailed stuff before we've explained how you set it up. And that was just too much. So yeah, it's a problem which it's not a red flag as in I won't work on this. It's a red flag as in
makes complete sense.
This is a big problem. You need to do something about.
Makes total sense. And I've know lots of rule books that I've experienced where there is a lot of it's strangely structured with lots of upfront about that kind of conceptual stuff that I'm like, I don't care yet. This doesn't seem like it's very helpful at this stage. So Mike asks, why don't more rule books use indexes to help facilitate finding keyword information?
Yeah, so indexes is not a thing that I generally use. But in the last 6 months, I've been starting to come round to the idea of having more indexes in them. So some rule books have indexes. Fantasy Flight Games books generally have indexes. Sometimes indexes go too far. You know, I've seen some games with indexes which is just like, you'd never look that up in the index. That's, you know, an index should be, a player is like, they've got a rule like adjacency. What does adjacent mean? And rather than flipping through the rulebook to find where the rules on adjacency are, what they should do is they should be able to go to the index, adjacency, page 3, go to page 3, right? That's fine. That's a good example of an index. A bad example of an index is putting something like game setup in the index, right? Because nobody would go to the index to see where's game setup. You'd go to the contents page to see where game setup was.
Yeah, completely.
But yeah, so index is an interesting one because some of the rulebooks that I've been working on in the last few years don't have indexes. Vital Lacerda's rulebooks don't have indexes. I'm considering suggesting to him that we put an index in Weather Machine. And that will be the first index in a Vital Lacerda rulebook.
And is that because they're potentially amenable to it because you've got quite a large number of keywords and those sort of things that come up?
It's not just that. It's just the fact that I've been coming more and more around to... So I personally don't use indexes that often. But over the last year and a half, I've heard a lot of feedback from people to say they find indexes really useful. So a little bit like what you did with the Mage Knight tutorial walkthrough thing. It wasn't needed. It was an optional extra that you did in order to help the people who would find that useful.
Yeah.
If creating an index is going to be 4 hours more work on a 100-hour job, it's worth it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to suggest,
especially with that kind of time commitment, right?
Yeah.
Like 4 hours.
The danger is, so one of the components of Weather Machine is the research tiles. So do I have research tiles in the index? Well, you would think yes. But then what do? Do I put every page that research tiles are mentioned on, which are about 10? So that's the thing. It's not just a case of, oh, you should have an index. It's like, yes, well, I should have an index, but what do? Do I do research tiles, how you get them? Page 12, how you spend them? Well, that's on page, there's 4 different ways you can spend them. So I'm like, I'm not quite sure where I go on that. And Vital might say no. He might say, no, Paul, we've got the contents page, and that's actually got that's got the breakdown of where everything is. So yeah,
it's indexes. A different one. I mean, indexes are a pain point. I know in a lot of academic publishing, working out what you do with them, and it's effectively the same kind of problem. Which, as you said, is like, well, how are you going to choose what goes in there, what doesn't? Yeah, you overstuff the index, you just end up with a replication of a lot of the book, and it's no longer useful as an index, right? It's like you have to somewhat deselect what goes in there to make it useful.
Yes. Yeah.
And those are kind of always pain point problems. So I think the last question we're going to have time for today, I'll save the others for another time, is from Liam. So it's ignoring grammar and spelling mistakes. What are the 3 biggest mistakes that people make when writing and editing rulebooks, and how are they best avoided?
So front-loading information, which we've just talked about. Which, for those people who don't know, it's basically a lot of information at the start of a rulebook which you do not need at that time. It's important. It's very important that you know it to play the game, but it's putting it in the right part of the rulebook and not right at the start. So that's one thing that's there. 2, the other thing is potentially breaking up the flow of your rulebook with going off on side tangents when something could be subsectioned out and moved on. Like I mentioned earlier on with the actions, you don't want to break up the middle of your rulebook with 10 pages detailing all of the actions when you could put all of the actions in an appendix at the back of the rulebook and then just, and I think the 3rd one is a lack of examples. Now, most of the rulebooks that I read have a lot of good examples with images, but some rulebooks don't give enough space for that, and you need to. But I also don't want to see silly examples. I don't want to see, if you take 3 apples to the fair, you gain 3 points. For example, James takes 3 apples to the fair and gains 3 points. No, right? I don't want to see that. But what I want to see is at the end of the game, all players will score 1 point for every 3 apples they have. For example, James has 7 apples, he gets 2 points. Yeah. Right. Okay. Because it would say round down in the text. you see an example of it happening. But where the example exactly matches word for word what the text is, then it's not useful. So yeah, examples, lots of them, but good ones.
So where they're genuinely disambiguating, they're not just repeating text, and effectively they are there to there should be some intuition behind their design around anything that wouldn't be incredibly obvious just from reading the text is where you want examples, right?
Yeah, if we're talking about examples, and this is another bit of a mistake that I do see, is never ever put rules in an example. So the example I've just given you was an example of doing it wrong. So I say at the end of the game, each player scores 1 point for every 3 apples they have.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah.
Example. James has 7 apples. He scores 2 points. You needed the example to know whether you needed to round down or not. And that is wrong. Okay. That text should have said rounded down.
Yeah. Completely.
Okay. Never ever put a rule only in an example, because an example should be optional. Right? You shouldn't need to read an example in order to be able to understand the rules. And you do see this. You see this occasionally. It's not often, but you do see it, that you're reading the rules and you get the rules, and then you read an example, and the example, there's another rule in the example that wasn't described in the actual rules text. And you're like, oh, right, okay. So I can move through my friends, for example, you know, so. Right,
this is because actually, you're hiding rules in the examples when really you need to have a clear differentiation between this is a rule and it's part of the continuous text. This is a tool for illustrating a rule.
Exactly. So you don't copy the text word for word, but you
because then the example is probably superfluous if that's
exactly. Yeah, you never put something in an example that hasn't actually been covered in the rules.
Yeah. Completely. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. Okay, great. Well, I'm sure that will be very practically useful to anyone who's interested in making their own games. So we're close to wrapping up now. What should we be on the lookout for from Gaming Rules coming up soon? Or
coming up soon. When are you planning this podcast to go out?
So this will be going out in late April.
Late April. So by then, the Keeper at Sea rules video will be out. Because Keeper at Sea is an expansion set to Keeper, designed by Richard Breeze.
Oh, right, yes. Yeah.
He's going on Kickstarter on the 19th of April. So I will have the video will be finished next week in preparation for that. It has so if you've got Keeper, if you've played Keeper and you like Keeper, it is an expansion to that. But it also has a solo mode in the game, designed by David Turtsey, obviously, because he's the I think there's a contract that's been made that he now designs the solo games for every single game in existence. I think that's the deal he's made.
Absolutely. He designs a phenomenal number of solo modes, doesn't he? I had a wonderful chat with him in Essen about getting some advice for solos, which was very useful for me.
So that's coming out. What else have I got coming out by the end of April? I can't actually remember. Let me just have a look at my calendar. I can tell you that my workload for April has changed. I mean, we've discussed work changing things before. So the things that I did have planned for April have actually now been sort of delayed, moved around, and everything else. But the Weather Machine rulebook with Vital Lacerda, I'm working on. People are not going to see that anytime soon. The Burn Cycle rulebook with Chip Theory Games, again, people are not going to see that anytime soon. A lot
of preparation probably then for lots of upcoming stuff and different videos.
Yeah, I will be working on the how to play videos for Stefan Fell's 2 new games, Hamburg and Amsterdam. They won't be finished by the end of April, but they will be hopefully sometime in May. I'm working on one of a video for Procyon, Defense of Procyon 3, which is David Turtsey's games. And lots of other playthroughs. I'm doing playthroughs generally 2 to 3 times a week at the moment on the channel. So there's lots of them coming out. I
understand you've been doing quite a lot of that as part of because I know you've been kind of pushing your Patreon, right?
Yeah.
You've been doing more kind of playthroughs and been able to balance that a bit more versus just doing rulebook stuff all the time.
Yeah,
right?
this has been probably the biggest change to my channel and my life over the last couple of years. Is the Patreon support is basically, it provides me the financial flexibility to take time off my paid work. Okay. So I have always said that the Patreon support is for the other stuff that I do. I don't want people to support me on Patreon for the rulebook work that I do, because I get paid to do the rulebook work.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not ideally wanting people to support me on Patreon to fund the sponsored videos that I do because they've already been paid for. Now, I know other people do that. I just don't feel comfortable about it. So for me, the Patreon campaign is to fund all of the other stuff that I don't normally get paid for. And the biggest change to the channel is because the Patreon has been fairly successful over the last couple of years, it enables me to take X number of days off a week during which I produce content or do things like this podcast. So for example, this weekend is Virtual Bake-On. This will have been and gone by the time this podcast comes out. But I am doing over the next 3 days, 7 live streams of different games, none of which are paid for, none of which are sponsored. And it is the Patreon support that funds that, because sure, I'm doing it at a weekend, but I've actually spent approximately 2 days of my life in the last month planning and organizing all of this.
Of course.
And it's all of that planning and preparation that's gone into it. So yeah, there's lots of videos coming up this weekend, but by the time this goes out, from now, there will be about 10 more videos on my channel of games that I'm playing.
Well, I mean, that's going to say right away. I want to say to the listeners then, look, if it means backing Paul's Patreon means that actually he does podcasts with me, then please do that, because that's how that I think is. Well, I think that's great. Now, I think that's really, really important. Well, you know, I think it's really great. I feel like I get a tremendous amount of value out of your Patreon, to be honest.
Well, thank you very much. It's giving something back, and it's really nice because the Patreon channel, and this is a whole other topic for another time, because when I launched the Patreon, I did so because so many other people had launched a Patreon, and it was like, oh, well, maybe I should as well, right? And I didn't really know what to expect from it, and it started out fairly small. And back then, I don't even think I was live streaming because I didn't have a good internet. Whereas now, a couple of years on, the Patreon is very important to me, and I just want to give more back. And I'm constantly enthusiastic about doing more stuff for the channel, covering more things, playing more games and everything else. And it isn't just, oh, well, the Patreon people are paying me this amount of money, therefore I need to treat it like I need to give something back. It's not that. It's more, this is actually encouraging me and stuff like that. And of course, Patreon supporters get to vote on which games I'm going to be playing and what they want to see and things like that. Sometimes it's the ones that I want to play, but very often it's, you know, the other day, one of my Patreon supporters had just bought a game and went online and said, oh, Paul, you've not done a tutorial of this game. How am I going to learn how to play it? And I was like, well, what are you doing next Wednesday? Do you want to play it? And we did. And we actually did. We did a live stream, and it was a live stream for Patreon supporters. So it wasn't a live stream that went public, but it was a live stream. And then we got somebody else who said, who else on the Patreon Slack channel wants to learn how to play this game? And they went, oh yeah, I'll play it as well. So all of a sudden, I did a live private stream for some Patreon supporters of me teaching some other Patreon supporters how to play a particular game. And it's nice. And at no point in that did I feel, well, they're giving me money every month, I really should give something back. It didn't feel like that at all. It was, they are helping me have the lifestyle that I want.
Yeah.
I want to do this. And of course, I got to teach people how to play games, which, you know, I love doing anyway.
Absolutely. So
and they sent me a package of Jaffa cakes in the post. So
yeah. Oh, as long as they say the Jaffa cakes, that's critical, right? Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. All right. Well, I just want to say thank you so much again for joining me. This has been so much fun. It's been tremendous going through all of those things. There's so many things that I really wanted to talk about that we had to leave off. So
we can do a part 2.
I would love to do a part 2.
We can absolutely do a part 2. We'll give some of the other people a chance to be on the show. But yeah, at some point when you want to come back for part 2, we do need, though, for part 2, to remind ourselves what we've talked about here, because otherwise we'll just talk about the same stuff again. So,
oh, don't worry, I will make a list, and I'm sure we won't be short of topics.
Yeah, cool. No, it's been a pleasure. You know me, I always like to chat about rule books and stuff, because coming on to a podcast like this and talking about it for 2 hours actually helps me as well, because what it's done is it's actually got more things going around in my mind. And it's the classic case where if you're just doing the job all day, every day, and not stopping to reflect on what you're doing, then you're not improving. So talking to you and getting questions from the listeners, you know, has been useful. And just talking through some of the things again, people say, oh, Paul, yeah, he's like a really, really good rulebook editor. And I say, no, I'm always improving. I'm always looking for where we can get better, where we can improve, and things like that. So yeah, it's been good.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.